Hello and good afternoon to you all. So before I go any further with this video, I need to stress that I'm not a lawyer or a medical professional in any way. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nurse. This is very important for you to understand because what I'm going off is simply what I've read, and I'm going to be continuing with the theme that I started yesterday, where I talked about that case in the family court in Bournemouth 2 years ago, where there was the added complication for the father that he seems to be HIV positive. And what I'm going to do is continue the theme of the impact of domestic abuse on those with HIV and ways in which HIV can be used as a weapon, both to where the victim is HIV positive themselves, and ways in which somebody with HIV who is HIV positive can weaponize it against the victim. Again, I need to stress here, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a doctor. What's not in doubt is that domestic abuse is very, very stressful. And stress can impact our mental and physical health. There's a book by Judith Herman Lewis called Trauma and Recovery. Judith Herman Lewis, Trauma and Recovery. I think it was published in 1992. And she talks about domestic abuse, the links between domestic abuse, domestic violence, and PTSD. I believe that Madison on the Anti-Alienation Project, she's also talked about the impact on our mental and physical health of parental alienation, which is, after all, a form of abuse. But the problem with HIV is that someone who is HIV positive, stress can lower their immune system considerably. And they're far more vulnerable to stress, decreasing their immune system, and making them more vulnerable to HIV becoming AIDS. This is something that there's a link between stress and the progression to AIDS, which is described in the American Journal of Psychiatry by Jane Lesserman in an article written in August 2000 in the American Journal of Psychiatry. So there's no doubt that domestic abuse can have an impact on somebody with HIV. It can also be used as a weapon. Now, some of the obvious ones you might think: somebody saying that somebody who has HIV is slutty or dirty. It can lead to allegations of promiscuity. The victim can be further isolated by the threat of exposure to others, especially in a society where there is still a lot of stigma attached to HIV and AIDS. And if you think about that case yesterday that I talked about, when the judge and the mother solicitor, or the recorder and the mother solicitor, were talking about the situation, they mentioned the fact that the father was black, African, and that his concealment was a horrendous deception. Now, just think about this for a second. We've had HIV and AIDS has been around for a long time, and you'd think we'd come past the stigma that was associated back in the 1980s, when, for example, when Rock Hudson died. HIV is a disease that has affected the whole world, just as COVID did. Whether or not you believe in it, COVID had an impact on the whole world, just as AIDS did. And so examples here of ways in which HIV can be used to hurt the victim. Again, saying that somebody with HIV is dirty, an accusation of being promiscuous, isolation, based on the threat of exposure. Sharing or threatening to share the person's HIV status on social media with landlords, with employers. It's worth noting that in 25 out of 50 states in America, there are actions that can be criminalised by somebody who's HIV positive, even though there's virtually no chance of the disease being passed on and have nothing to do with sex. So that's half of America still stigmatising people with HIV. Use of HIV as a weapon in a custody battle, preventing the person accessing medication and medical care, stealing their pills, threatening to share their status with an employer, increasing their chance of being dismissed. And here's a good one. Here's one that has not been touched on. I've heard of a case, somebody reached out to me and talked to me about this. I've heard of a case where an HIV positive woman was abusing her partner, but claiming to be the victim of abuse. And when she fled the house, claiming that she and her children were fleeing for their lives, she deliberately left her medication behind to add colour to the story that she was fleeing for her life. Now, that is something that has not been touched on by anyone, as far as I'm aware. When it comes to HIV and domestic abuse, there is no doubt that it lowers the level, the immunity to the immune system, and increases the chance of the person with HIV contracting AIDS. So if you think about the stresses that we as men suffer as victims of domestic abuse, not being believed, usually being the ones thrown to a cell when we report domestic abuse or even domestic violence, the risk of losing our children. This is an added stress to men who are HIV positive, and because as parents the worst nightmare we can have is something happening to our children, losing our children. That is the worst nightmare any parent will have. And so when you throw that at somebody who is already HIV positive, you are increasing the chances that they will succumb to the disease and become and contract AIDS. Now, because this is not something, this has not been really touched on in any of the videos I've seen about domestic abuse, it's something that clearly has not been thought of, which is fine. But then we're not doctors. Well, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a social worker. I'm not a police officer. It is not my job to cater or look after or tend to victims of domestic abuse or prosecute perpetrators of abuse. But the professionals whose job it is to know this stuff, when you think about it, you have professionals who are supposed to safeguard victims of domestic abuse, adding to the stress, adding to the trauma, and increasing the possibility that the person will die, not through suicide or heart attacks, but through progression from HIV to AIDS. And again, you've got that situation where a female perpetrator of domestic abuse left her meds behind to add colour to her story that she's a victim. Think about that. Please like and share.